The Pullman Strike was part of a larger labor-based movement that took place in the 19th century. It was caused by George Pullman, the owner of the Pullman car company, lowering his workers' wages in the Depression of 1893 while refusing to reduce the rental costs of the housing in the town of Pullman. The strike ended with no compromise, but it spread awareness around the country of how poorly the working class was being treated. The inhumane conditions Pullman subjected his workers to persuaded the pro-capital government to believe that labor unions had a role in protecting workers' rights. In the 18th and 19th centuries, a huge technological advance took place called the Industrial Revolution. One of the biggest inventions during the Industrial Revolution was the steam train. Train travel was very uncomfortable. Ouch! Often too hot, with hard wooden benches to sit on. Seriously, ow! George Pullman regularly traveled on trains. One sleepless night on a train, he toyed with the idea of a train car where comfortable cushioned seats could be converted into beds at night. In 1858, he created the sleeping car that gave customers a smoother, more comfortable ride. It was a hit. In 1867, with 48 cars in service, Pullman founded the Pullman Car Company and soon had several thousand workers. Life in cities was hard, overcrowded, and unsafe. You okay, man? Pullman's brilliant idea to fix this issue was to build his own village that would improve the living conditions for his workers and remove them from the influence of unions. Pullman named it, of course, after himself. It was completed in 1885 and housed 9,000 Pullman workers and their families. It appeared to be a glorious town with all the amenities one would need. But as Reverend William Carradine wrote in his book, The Pullman Strike, like the stage, there is something behind the scenes, and that which is behind the scenes does not harmonize with the effect which is produced before the curtain. Most visitors only saw the showcase center of the town, with the monumental Hotel Florence, the Grand Arcade, and the elegant housing for managers. But concealed on the outskirts, rows of wooden shacks brought misery to most of the inhabitants. Pullman exploited these workers in rent, commodities, and utilities. Even the town's greenstone church stood idle due to the high rent. When a group of pastors approached Pullman for rent reduction, he said, "When that church was built, it was not intended so much for the moral and spiritual welfare of the people as it was for the completion of the artistic effect of the scene." Pullman manipulated his workers so they would not see the wrongs of these conditions. Public speakers were not allowed. I believe that living conditions should improve for the people.
She's lying. Nothing you hear is true.
He excluded any play in his theater that would get people angry at his authority. He had a bar in his Hotel Florence that was reserved for only rich guests.
Oh, it's been such a hard day. I can't wait to get
Hey, wait a sec. You're not allowed here. Get out! But get out! A feeling of fear oppressed the town. In 1893, the country slipped into a terrible economic depression, lowering demand for Pullman cars, causing him to fire 1,500 workers. The remaining workers saw their wages cut by 25 and 50%. At the same time, Pullman refused to lower the rents. Work continued, but layoffs increased, so by spring there were only 3,500 workers, about half the number from just 3 years before. So despite the low demand for Pullman cars, the company still made money, and stockholders received dividends. On June 20, 1893, a group of railroad workers met in Chicago and formed the ARU, American Railway Union. Eugene Debs was elected president. In April of 1894, the ARU led a successful strike against the Great Northern Railroad, and after 18 days of striking, they went into arbitration and wages were restored. This inspired many people to join the ARU. Over 1/3 of the Pullman workers joined. They wanted wages to be restored and rent to be reduced. Meetings between union members and Pullman were held on May 7th and 9th, but Pullman refused to restore wages or lower rents, saying rents were handled by a separate corporation. The following morning, gate supervisors stopped and fired 3 men without explanation. They were all union committee members, This was the final straw. Something had to happen. Union leaders decided to walk out on May 11th. At exactly 10:30, union leaders walked off the job. 3,000 of the Pullman workers participated. Company officials closed down the plant. Jane Addams of Chicago's Civic Federation approached the ARU and Pullman about arbitration. The ARU was in favor of arbitration, but Pullman refused because he didn't like unions and didn't want labor leaders to think that a strike would cause him to change his ways. On June 26, ARU members refused to allow any Pullman car to move unless there was a mail car attached. If mail cars were tampered with, federal troops would get involved, and that was not what Debs wanted. The railroad owners had formed the General Managers Association, or GMA. They tried to end the strike by announcing that any switchman who refused to move rail cars would be fired. Debs responded, saying that if a switchman was fired, all union members across the country would walk off their jobs. By June 29th, 50,000 people were striking. Strike supporters began halting Pullman cars, and soon there was no movement on the railroads west of Chicago. Debs went to Blue Island, a railroad yard, to ask the workers to support the strike. They were angry because they felt discriminated against, so they joined and, against Debs' wishes, started destroying and burning cars. Attorney General Richard Olney, who supported the GMA and wanted to break up unions, requested that President Grover Cleveland send federal troops to end the strike. Olney said of the strike, "Whatever was done should be done at Chicago. If smashed there, it would collapse everywhere else." On July 2nd, Olney obtained an injunction from a federal court saying that the strike was illegal. When the strikers didn't obey the injunction, President Cleveland sent federal troops to Chicago. This enraged the strikers and the citizens of Chicago, and riots started. Many people were killed or wounded from bullets fired from the troops. On July 10th, Debs and 3 other union leaders were arrested for ignoring the injunction. Later that day, he was released, and he then decided that the strike was a lost cause. Since the government had sided with the railroad companies, Pullman still refused arbitration, and there was no public support. Boo! On July 17th, Debs was arrested again and served a 6-month jail term. Some railroad workers returned to their old jobs with no increase in wage. Others were blacklisted, which meant that they couldn't join any railroad company in the United States. When Debs completed his 6-month term, he found that the ARU no longer existed. Well, where is everyone? The Pullman Strike seemed like a failure with no compromise reached. Although it may have looked like a tragedy in the short term, in the long run there was a more positive outcome. George Pullman was no longer viewed as a kind and generous employer who took care of his workers, but as a greedy and intolerant man. Even other capitalists regarded him as such, like Marcus Hanna of Cleveland, a millionaire who owned a factory. Hanna said of George Pullman, "A man who won't meet his workers halfway is a goddamn fool." The U.S. government began to study what exactly had caused the Pullman strike. Workers, military officials, and railroad company officials, including George Pullman, were questioned. The commission found that given the size and power of companies, unions had a role to play to protect workers. After the strike, Richard Olney, who originally didn't believe in unions, was now a strong supporter and supported the law that was passed in 1898 that made it illegal for companies to prevent their workers from joining unions. It also called for arbitration in railroad disputes. Those legal changes marked the first time the government helped labor struggle with the capitalist system. Because of the strike, a lesson was learned that other strikes could be avoided if the company owner and labor accepted arbitration. The newfound appreciation of laborers and laws that were passed to protect them is proof that the Pullman strike advanced the rights of the working class and the rules of unions.
You've got to join that one big union. You've got to join it by yourself. Everybody here was joining with you. You've got to join the one big union by yourself. If that road